There is a plant growing in the cracks of your driveway right now that is likely the most misunderstood organism in the history of agriculture. It is almost certainly growing on the side of the highway you take to work. Thriving in the exhaust fumes and the scorching heat, it is growing in the fields where your food is produced, where it is treated as a mortal enemy. You have been taught to call it a weed. You have been taught to poison it, burn it, and rip it from the earth to make room for the weak. Genetically modified corn and soy that dominate our food system. But if you stripped away the modern labels, if you looked past the propaganda of the chemical companies, and if you looked at the biology under a microscope, you would see something that defies logic. This plant contains more calcium than whole milk. It contains a protein structure so complete it rivals beef. It holds an amino acid profile that modern wheat has completely lost. For 8,000 years, this was not a weed. It was the caloric backbone of an empire that spanned a continent. It was the fuel for warriors, the sustenance for nursing mothers, and the sacred offering to the gods. And today, despite 500 years of systematic attempts to erase it from history, it is arguably the most resilient plant on Earth. It has outsmarted every herbicide we have thrown at it. It has survived the collapse of civilizations. It is waiting for you to realize that the ultimate survival food is not sitting on a supermarket shelf wrapped in plastic. It is growing for free in the soil we tried to sterilize. The archive opens in the year 1519, when the Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, arrived in the Valley of Mexico. They were stunned by what they saw. They expected to find savages. Instead, they found Tenochtitlan, a city larger, cleaner, and better fed than any capital in Europe. They walked through the great market of Tlatelolco, which served 60,000 people a day. They saw mountains of corn. They saw beans. They saw squash. But towering above them all were bins, overflowing with a tiny, golden grain. The Spanish commanders looked at the Aztec tax records, known as the Times Matricula de Tributos *, to understand the source of this civilization's power. These documents tell us exactly how important this crop was. Every single year, the empire collected over 20,000 tons of this grain in tribute from its provinces. That is exactly the same amount as the corn they collected. Think about the implications of that number. In the greatest civilization of the Americas, this weed was the nutritional equal of corn. It was the twin pillar of their society. But it was more than food. It was divinity. During the great religious festivals, particularly the feast of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, the Aztecs would take the seeds of this plant and mix them with honey and, in some accounts, human blood. They would mold this paste, called times Tzoali *, into life-sized statues of their gods. They would parade these statues through the streets of Tenochtitlan, worship them, and then, at the climax of the ceremony, they would break the statues into pieces and eat them. It was a communion. They were eating the body of their god to gain his strength. The Spanish friars watching this were terrified. They saw a distorted reflection of the Catholic Eucharist. They saw the heathens eating a sacred bread, and they realized that as long as this food existed, they could never fully convert the population. They realized that the Aztec spirit was physically and spiritually tied to this grain. So, the conquistadors did not just discourage the crop, they declared a war of extermination against it. In a move of unparalleled cultural vandalism, Cortés issued a decree. He outlawed the cultivation of the grain. He ordered the fields to be burned. He ordered the granaries to be smashed and the seeds thrown into the lake. And then he issued a punishment that sounds like fiction but is historical fact. Anyone caught growing this plant would have their hands cut off. Anyone caught eating it would be put to death. They systematically dismantled the agricultural infrastructure of a continent to erase a single plant. For 300 years, the Spanish Empire hunted this seed. They forced the indigenous population to grow old world crops like wheat and barley crops that struggled in the Mexican climate, crops that required irrigation, crops that made the people weak and dependent. This created a cycle of poverty. If you cannot grow your own food, you must buy it from your conqueror. So what did the Aztecs know that we have forgotten? Why was this grain worth dying for? Let me tell you what is actually inside this seed. The nutritional profile is so dense, it looks like a mistake in the data. We have to talk about protein. We are told that wheat is the staff of life. But biologically, wheat is a cripple. It is an incomplete protein. It lacks lysine, an essential amino acid. Lysine is the limiting amino acid in most grains. It is the key that unlocks the door for protein synthesis. Without lysine, your body cannot fully utilize the protein you eat. It cannot effectively build muscle, repair tissue, or create antibodies. Because wheat and corn are low in lysine, you have to eat massive amounts of them, or combine them with beans. To get what you need, this ancient grain is different. It is a complete protein. It contains a massive amount of lysine, twice as much as wheat and 3 times as much as corn. It has a protein score of 75, which is dangerously close to the perfect score of 100 found in an egg. It provides the building blocks of life without the inflammatory baggage of gluten. Now look at the minerals. This is where the comparison becomes embarrassing for modern agriculture. A single cup of this cooked grain delivers over 5 milligrams of iron. That is nearly 30% of your daily requirement in one bowl. Compare that to white rice, which offers barely a fraction of a milligram unless it is artificially fortified in a factory. The calcium numbers are even more aggressive. A cup of the leaves of this plant, because, yes, the leaves are edible too, contains nearly double the calcium found in a glass of milk. More importantly, it is packaged with magnesium and silicon, which allows your body to actually absorb it. Wheat cannot do this. Corn cannot do this. We have spent billions of dollars engineering crops to be shelf-stable, while ignoring the crop that was engineered by nature to build the bone density of warriors. But it gets stranger. The biology of this plant operates on a completely different software than most of our food. It uses a photosynthesis pathway called C4. Most of the vegetables you eat, like wheat, rice, and soy, use C3 photosynthesis. This means they are inefficient. When it gets hot, they have to close their pores to save water, which stops them from growing. They are fragile. This ancient grain is a C4 plant. It is a biological super engine. It has a specialized anatomy that allows it to concentrate carbon dioxide. It acts like a pump. It can keep its pores closed to save water while still churning out energy from the sun. It thrives in drought. It thrives in the blistering heat that kills corn. It grows in poor, rocky soil where wheat would wither and die. It does not need to be coddled. It does not need massive irrigation networks draining our aquifers. It simply needs to exist. The ancient people of the Andes and the Mesoamerican highlands did not have a word for gluten intolerance. They did not have a word for celiac disease. They did not need one. They were eating a grain that is naturally gluten-free, highly digestible, and anti-inflammatory. So, here is the question nobody wants to answer. If this food is so perfect, if it grows so easily, if it fed millions of people for thousands of years, and if it is scientifically superior to wheat, why are you not eating it? Why is it not in every loaf of bread? Why is it not the base of every school lunch? The answer is one of the darkest and most ironic chapters in agricultural history. The suppression did not end with the Spanish. It evolved. Today, the enemy is not a religious empire, but an economic one. In the mid-20th century, chemical agriculture began to take over the world. Companies like Monsanto and Bayer needed farmers to buy patented seeds and the herbicides required to protect them. They created a system of monoculture, miles and miles of genetically identical corn and soy, kept alive by life support systems of chemicals. In this system, any plant that is not the cash crop is an enemy. They classified this ancient grain as a noxious weed. They gave it a new, ugly name to strip it of its dignity. They called it pigweed. This was a calculated linguistic murder. You do not eat pigweed. You poison pigweed. For decades, the chemical giant sold billions of dollars of glyphosate, known commercially as Roundup, specifically to kill this plant in soy and cotton fields. They created a war between the farmer and the most nutritious plant on his land. They told the farmers that this weed was stealing their profits. But then, nature fought back. And the way it fought back is the most terrifying thing the chemical industry has ever seen. In the late 1990s, in the cotton fields of Georgia, farmers noticed something wrong. They would spray the fields with Roundup. Everything would die. But the pigweed would still be standing. It wasn't withering. It was green. It was healthy. They increased the dosage. The plant grew stronger. They mixed cocktails of different poisons. The plant shook it off and grew 10 feet tall in a matter of weeks. The stems became as thick as baseball bats. The combine harvesters that tried to run them over would shatter. The metal blades would break against the fibrous stalks of the weed. They called it a superweed. They called it an agricultural nightmare. The news reports showed farmers crying, abandoning thousands of acres of land because they could not kill this plant. But they were looking at it upside down. It was not a nightmare. It was the return of the king. The plant had evolved resistance to the herbicide. Because it produces 500,000 seeds from a single mother plant, and because it is a genetic scavenger, it adapted faster than the scientists could invent new poisons. It was reclaiming the land. They classified it as a threat because they could not profit from it. You cannot patent a plant that produces 500,000 seeds for free. You cannot sell a seed that grows in the cracks of the pavement without your permission. You cannot force a farmer to buy a crop that reseeds itself with such aggressive abundance. You cannot monopolize a weed. The chemical companies spent decades and billions of dollars trying to kill the very food that could solve global hunger, simply because it was free. This is the logic of the market. If it can feed you for free, it is a weed. If you have to pay for it, it is a crop. But here is what they could not erase: the seed itself, the knowledge itself. While the Spanish were burning fields in the lowlands, the knowledge retreated to the places the empire could not reach. But knowledge does not die. It only sleeps. While the empire burned the valleys, the grandmothers in the high mountains of Peru kept a handful of seeds in a jar. In the remote villages of India, where the seed had traveled via trade routes before the ban, they never stopped worshipping it. In India, they call it Times Rajgira *. The name literally translates to the king's grain, or Times Ramdana *, God's grain. During Hindu fasting periods, when wheat and rice and lentils are forbidden because they are considered heavy or dead foods, this is the grain they eat. They know it provides the strength to endure. They know it is times sattvic, times pure and life-giving. In Nepal, the Sherpas eat a gruel made from it to power their ascents up the Himalayas. They call it times marshy *. They treat it with reverence because they know it warms the body from the inside. In the Andes of Peru, they call it times kiwicha *. It is not famine food there. It is premium cuisine. It is used to make soups, toasted snacks, and porridges that sustain the hard labor of mountain life. In the 1980s, NASA discovered kiwicha. They were looking for the perfect food for astronauts, something lightweight, nutrient-dense, and easy to digest. They chose this ancient grain. The food that the Spanish banned as savage was flown into space as the pinnacle of nutrition. And in Mexico, the homeland, It survived in the most clever disguise of all. It survived in a candy. It is called Times Alegria *, which means joy. Think about the irony. The Spanish tried to destroy the heathen food, but the indigenous people hid the sacred seed inside a sticky bar of honey and molasses sold on the street corners of Mexico City for centuries. They hid the body of their god in plain sight, right under the noses of the colonists. The priests thought it was just a sweet treat for children. The people knew it was a capsule of survival. The knowledge was fragmented. Yes, but it was incomplete. Half the world never forgot. The other half was taught to worship the replacement, to worship the wheat and the corn that kept them sick and dependent. That moment is now. The seed has returned. We know it today as Amaranth. So here is what you do. You stop looking at the ground with the eyes of a chemical company and start looking with the eyes of an ancestor. You might find wild amaranth growing in your yard right now. It has a distinctive red root. It has broad, oval leaves. And late in the season, it throws up a magnificent spike of flowers that can be purple, red, gold, or green. But before you run out and harvest, you must be smart. You must be educated. You must recognize that because this plant is a vacuum cleaner for the soil, it will absorb whatever is in the ground. If you find it on the side of a busy highway or in a chemically treated park, do not eat it. It may have concentrated lead, nitrates, or the very herbicides designed to kill it. You want to find it in clean soil, or better yet, buy a packet of seeds for $2 and throw them in a patch of dirt. They will grow. You cannot stop them from growing. You can eat the young leaves like spinach. They are better than spinach. They do not turn into slime when you cook them. They hold their texture and their nutty flavor. You can harvest the seeds in the autumn. You simply shake the flower head into a bag, and thousands of grains will fall out. You can pop them in a hot skillet like tiny popcorn. In 10 seconds, they explode into white puffs. You can mix them with honey to make your own Times Alegria *. You can boil them into a porridge that will keep you full for 6 hours. You can grind them into flour to mix with your baking. There is a safety note you must respect. The raw, mature leaves contain oxalic acid, just like spinach and chard. It is best to cook them or steam them to neutralize it. Do not eat giant bowls of raw, mature amaranth leaves every day if you are prone to kidney stones. But cooked, it is a powerhouse. When you cook this grain, you are doing more than making dinner. You are reclaiming the name that the Spanish Empire tried to erase. You are reclaiming the biodiversity that the chemical companies tried to poison. You are eating the superweed that broke the combine harvesters. Every person who plants amaranth in their garden is one more proof that nature cannot be patented. Every time you eat a bowl of Times Rajgira Times or Times Kiwicha *, you are participating in a 500-year-old resistance movement. You are opting out of the system that wants you weak and opting into the biology that makes you strong. The grain they burned is back. The grain they outlawed is growing in your driveway. The grain they taught you was a weed is the future of food. The Aztecs knew. The Spanish commanders definitely knew. The farmers in Georgia losing their tractors know. And now you know. Amaranth is still here, still rising in the cracks of the concrete, still absorbing the sun with ancient efficiency, still holding the protein that built empires, still waiting for anyone willing to shake the seeds into their hand and take a bite. It can feed you. If this opened something for you, subscribe. Every share helps preserve the knowledge they spent centuries trying to erase. The next vault opens soon.